Hi, fantasy readers. This is Karyne Norton, your fellow book binger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. If you haven't listened to last week's episode, you'll want to do that before continuing with today's, because we're finishing off the second half of J.A. Andrews' epic fantasy short story featuring Chesavia, who's a keeper going up against some very dark magic. It's written by J.A. Andrews, who lives deep in the Rocky Mountains of Montana with her husband and 3 children. She is eternally grateful to C.S. Lewis for showing her the luminous world of Narnia, and she wishes Jane Austen had lived 200 years later so they could be pen pals. She's also furious at J.K. Rowling for introducing her to house elves without providing her a way to actually employ one. And she is constantly jealous of her future self, who she is sure has everything figured out. Be sure to stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from Janice, as well as how to enter our summer giveaway with fantastic audiobooks and an Audible subscription. For now, please enjoy The Shadowed Blade, Part 2, by J.A. Andrews. Chapter 5. Chesavia dragged her focus back to Karn's wound for the 100th time, funneling the sunlight into his body, augmenting what was left of the healing. But the doorway into the main hall of Naj's tent had been left open all day as he and his warriors planned their retaliation for last night's attack. Fran still stood guard at the door of Karn's room, the inner door this time, and more guards were placed in every other direction. She hadn't spoken to Naj since Fran had escorted her back to Karn's room to sleep, but it was only a matter of time before the chief found her to demand how she'd known the attackers were approaching. She'd spent the day searching for an explanation that wouldn't make it obvious that healing was far from her only skill. Chesavia picked up a clean bandage and traced the simple connection rune onto it, then began on the intricate healing rune. Naj's voice rose in the hall. Spare their women? If the Pethin wanted their clan safe, they would have sworn allegiance to me, not snuck up like cowards and tried to kill me. Rennis winced, and Chesavia leaned over to see Naj stalking through the hall, his hands gripping the hilts of his swords as though itching to draw them again. If we spare their women, he said coldly, they'll poison our food or kill us in our sleep. No, we spare children between 5 and 10 years old who can be trained in our ways. Lorn Tok sacrificed the rest of them when he attacked me. Rennis shifted closer to Chesavia. If Naj Tok speaks to you today, she said quietly, tread lightly. The days after he fights, his demon is always restless. Chesavia turned back to Karn and absently pressed Vital into the bandage in her hand. It flowed in weakly, and she dragged her focus back to the cloth. The healing rune was messy and misshapen. She let out an annoyed breath and dropped it in the pile of used bandages. At Rennis's questioning look, Chesavia flicked a dismissive finger at it. The rune is wrong, but close enough it almost works. Modifying working runes was painfully slow and would more likely than not end up only creating unexpected complications. It would take an hour to fix one even this simple. His commands continued to flow out from the hall, and Chesavia kept as much of her mind on the healing as she could, while still waiting for him to set the swords aside, even for a moment. She rubbed a finger over one of her rings. Objects enchanted to hold Vital always had a limit. She'd destroyed 2 rings before she'd learned that. But this sword was meant to hold the Vital of an entire person. The amount required to destroy it must be more. Possibly much more. With the beams of sunlight pouring in through the chimney holes in the roof, though, there should be plenty. She paced through the sick room as the afternoon dragged on, But Naj kept the swords at his belt and the room full of his warriors. The lower the sun sank and the less sunlight filtered into the tent, the harder that Vital became to reach. She moved toward the hall, forming some idea of calling him to the sick room for a moment. But at the door, Fran blocked her hand with his arm. "I am commanded to keep you in here," he said quietly, his voice firm, "at all costs." Two other huge warriors shifted to face her. Naj glanced across the room, his face growing savage when he caught sight of her. Without acknowledging her, he turned back to his men. Fran pushed her back and stepped inside after her, dropping the flap of the door closed behind him, trapping her in the sick room. Jasavia listened with a growing apprehension as the war council continued. The sunlight drained from the sky, and the lanterns were lit. It was fully dark before Naj sent his men away. The flap of the door swept open, and he strode into Karyne's room, the lantern light casting his face into sharp angles. "My son?" he demanded. Jasavia set down the scalpel she'd already cleaned 3 times, keeping her voice level. "He will be well. The wound is fully healed. All he requires now is rest to regain his strength." Naj's eyes scraped over her, calculation and fury warring inside them. "You saved his life," he said, as though listing off an accounting of her deeds. "And you warned me last night before the attack." He looked pointedly at her hand, which was empty of the crescent moon ring. She tensed for his next question. But he turned on his heels. "Come, I'm hungry." The normally busy main hall of his tent was eerily empty, but his personal chambers were just as they had been the first night, glowing in warm hues of reds and golds. He stood in the center of the room with his arms crossed, his back to her, and his swords still at his waist. "Sit." The command in his voice was so much like King Lennis's that she had to smother a spark of resentment. As she'd done so many times at court, she clasped her hands together, feeling the hum of Vital in her rings, and sat. He didn't move. "You were not injured last night?" Jasavia asked. Silence filled the room for long enough that she began to search for another question. "I assume you've read many books in your life," he said finally, without turning. His tone held a note of accusation, and a knot of dread formed in her gut. "Have you read that one?" Jasavia glanced around and found a book lying on the end of the table. It was a thin blue volume titled Lands and History of Northern Queensland. She didn't recognize the author, but the dread grew. "I don't believe I have." He finally turned, staring at her with an undecipherable expression. "I found the passage on the marked page especially enlightening." Jasavia picked up the book, opening to where a light green ribbon marked a page. She caught the word she'd been dreading. "Read it out loud to me," he said, "just so I can be sure I understand everything it's saying." She hesitated, but there was no point in refusing. "The Keepers of Queensland are an interesting brotherhood. They are almost exclusively from Queensland, yet their order is outside the authority of the Crown. They are few in number, even fewer active at any time, although they live to a very old age, hidden away in their stronghold, where they record and study histories. They are storytellers and magic wielders and—" Jasavia forced herself to read the rest of the passage. "Sometimes nearly miraculous healers. They are proficient writers and often utilize runes in their magical pursuits. They are, on the whole, reluctant to use violence or control others by force. But they yield great influence, even sitting on the council of the reigning monarch in Queenstown. She left the page open, reading over the words again. A commoner's view of the keepers, she thought absently, but an accurate one as far as it goes. I have heard of your King Lennis, Naj said coldly. He is reputed to be petty and conceited, a wretch who degrades even his own advisors. He paused. Is he worse to women? The dread inside Chisavia softened to something different, something more resigned. Ah, he breathed at her silence. How many women are in your brotherhood of keepers? Chisavia kept her focus on the page. Almost none. Then you do not deny you're one of them? Naj asked, his voice so low she could barely hear it. But you'd keep it hidden and parade yourself as a mere healer. She met his gaze. In a land where such a person is seen as a thing to exploit, I certainly wasn't going to announce it. And I did come here to heal your son. But your skills far surpass mere healing. Healing is the pinnacle of my skills, she answered, her irritation growing. It is what I study and what I practice. Not all the world sees conquest and killing as the highest goal. He dismissed her words with a wave. How did you sense the men coming to attack last night? Chisavia picked up a piece of the bread from the center of the table. If I'm going to be interrogated, may I at least eat? It's been a long day, and I've spent a great deal of energy healing your son. He gave a brief nod. She took a bite. Keepers can sense living things around them, if they try. He raised an eyebrow. How many people are in my tent? She cast out. He flared into light, and the wretched swords burst into bright lines of fire. But aside from that, her wave rolled through the tent, finding no one but the sleeping form of Karyne in his room. You, me, and your son. Although you have at least a dozen men surrounding the tent. He pointed at her. That is a better skill than healing. No, she said simply. It is not. He finally sat, still studying her with an unreadable look. You are not wearing the ring I gave you. The bread felt too dry in her mouth, and she set the rest down. Your son is almost healed. I have no intention of staying on the moors once my task is complete. Because you only came here to heal him, he said in a disbelieving tone. The power of her wave faded, and Naj dimmed back to normal. The blades on the table, though, glowed for an extra breath. She nodded. As I have told you more than once. His face remained skeptical, and she searched his expression for any sign of the intelligent, curious man she'd dined with before. She found only shrewdness and hunger. Sighing, she looked pointedly at the book. I'm a keeper. When I choose to leave, do you really think you can stop me? He leaned forward, his food and wine untouched. I think, he said in a low voice, that I can stop anything. His hand twitched toward his black sword, but he closed his fist and held it still. I meant it when I said you and I could rule the moors. You are the piece I have been missing. With your powers at my side, I will be unstoppable. You walked into my camp under your own power, but I'm not one to let such providence slip through my grasp. His words sent a chill down her spine. As my wife, you will be treated well, honored even. You'll have freedom to do anything you like in our clan. Something almost generous appeared in his face, Don't worry. Ruling the Moors is merely the first step. Then we shall conquer Napon and coastal Balon, and then your Queensland. Within a year, you will be home again, and your weak king will never speak down to you again. Chisavia stood, leaving the food and wine on the table. I will be leaving tomorrow. I have no intention of tomorrow is the battle, he said, his hand closing on the hilt of the sword. The Pethan clan will die, and I will absorb their herds and their wealth. There will be no distractions from that. Tendrils of black slipped out of the sword sheath and caressed his hand. I will chain you to a stake in the ground if you so much as look for an escape tomorrow. She took a step back from the table, and he turned to his food, the dismissal as strong as a physical push. Turning, she moved quickly out of his chambers. Next time I see you, he said when she reached the doorway, you'll be wearing the ring. The swords must be destroyed. The chill of the darkest hours seeped into the Tsar. Chisavia cast out again, finding the same thing she'd found for the past 6 hours. Guards stationed in every direction, but no one inside besides herself and Karyne, and the still form of Naj, who slept with one arm thrown over the blazing heat of his swords. Tomorrow, those swords would cut through the other clan with as much ease as they had cut through the attackers who'd come. And not just the Pithan clan warriors, but the women and children too, except the few Naj took as slaves. The black sword, at least, must be destroyed. The air was still and stifling. She rolled over in her bedroll for the 100th time, and her blanket twisted around her feet, her pathetically weak plan spinning in her head. Destroying the black sword would take sunlight, a torrent of it most likely. But if she could hold it outside at dawn... The sprawl of the Montan clan stretched out around her like the army it was, ready to cut down anyone at the merest hint of opposition. With a great deal of effort and an equal amount of luck, she could possibly sneak through them while it was dark. She cast out again. Naj hadn't stationed any guards inside his tent. The fact prodded at her like an irritating pebble in her shoe. Naj knew she was a keeper, had some idea at least of her capabilities, and yet after the way dinner had ended, he'd set up no protection between himself and her. It was either a trap, or he was extremely confident in his ability to best her, confident enough to sleep, because if he wasn't asleep, he had done an excellent job of pretending to be for the last several hours. Or he knew that even if she killed him, she'd never escape the sea of tents outside. She shoved the thought from her mind. Not the violence of the storm. In his room, Naj rolled onto his back, and his arm slid off the swords. Without giving herself time to think, she rose silently to her feet. There was no sunlight, and her hands trembled, her rings pathetically weak in the face of... She shook her head. It didn't matter what she faced. A little discomfort was a small price to pay for achieving such a goal. She dressed quickly, donning her black keeper's robe, despite the warmth of the night. She pulled on her pack and glanced around Karyne's room. The only thing left of hers was the silver crescent ring from Naj. It glittered on a low table like a symbol of a different place. A place where a warlord had the capability to read and relax and carry on conversations. A hopeful version of the Moors she'd never imagined feeling. A place without corrupting violence and greed and death-wielding swords. She was starting to turn away from it when she paused. Its hammered surface caught the dim lantern light and glittered, and the thought of the moon stiffened her resolve. She swept it up, dropped it in her pocket, and moved toward Naj's chambers. A shuttered lantern hung just outside her door, and she drew some of the vital out of the flame, a stream of burning heat flowing into her hands and filling her rings to their limit. The rest of the Tassar was steeped in shadows. Chasavia pulled the lantern off its hook, closed the shutters fully, and stepped to the main hall. Her footsteps sank soundlessly into the thick hides, and her black robe melded with the shadows. She kept up a continual series of waves, watching the bright form of the guards for any movement. Reaching the door of Naj's room, she paused. He slept on his back, his face turned away toward where both swords lay along the edge of his bed. Chasavia moved silently across the floor, but he stayed still, his breath coming slow and steady. At the side of the bed, she set the lantern on the floor and cracked the shutter open, keeping the light away from Naj's face, but illuminating the hilts of the swords. Each was slid a handbreadth out from its sheath. Flickers of blue flame licked along the blade of the bottom sword, and fingers of shadow gripped the top one. The lantern light caught on thin runes she hadn't noticed before, carved into the steel just above the crossguard. These were not Naj's rough attempt to name his blades. These runes were delicate and masterful. She caught sight of a basic connection rune and leaned closer. The complex runes around it were similar enough to the ones she used for healing that everything about the transfer of vital through the sword fell into place. The black sword tore the life out of whoever touched the blade in an instant, then gradually transferred it up through the wielder and into the blue sword. It fueled their fighting until the power was used up, and the black sword was ready to kill again, all while protecting and strengthening the wielder himself. The rune work was efficient and powerful, and if she set aside the fact that it dealt out an extremely fast death, it was impressive. Naj shifted, and she froze, but he didn't wake. She leaned closer, searching for anything that would describe the limits of what the sword could hold, but the parameters were suitably vague. It drew in a soul, which could technically mean something as enormous and powerful as a dragon, but since the sword seemed to be filled up with a single human death, she doubted its limit was that high. A low, simmering hunger brushed at her mind, and her hand itched to seize the hilt. A burning need boiled up in her to strike Naj down where he lay, rid the world of his violence, purge this clan of his ruthlessness. A dart of cold fear ran through her at the vividness of the thought, and she pulled back. The hunger faded. The sky through Naj's chimney lightened from black to dark blue. She shook out her hands, bracing herself against the call of the blade. The hilt of the blue sword pressed against Naj's hip. Dismissing it, she focused on the shadowed one. Without anything feeding it, the blue sword should become no more dangerous than a normal blade. Carefully envisioning exactly how to pick up the black sword so as not to disturb the rest of the bed or brush the deadly blade, she stretched out her fingers and touched the hilt. A pulse of vital drove into her, and in that moment, the sword latched onto her, not to suck life out of her, but to probe her mind, searching for something. And then it recognized something, and wrapped grasping fingers around her mind, searching deeper. Naj's hand shot out and clamped down on her wrist. She yanked away from him, but his grip was like iron. He tore out of bed, shoving her back and snatching up the sword. "You steal from me?" he thundered. She slammed against one of the tent posts, the corner digging into her shoulder blade. She flung her hands up, grasping his forearm and funneling vital in through her old, crudely made moon ring. It shoved toward his mind, trying to put him to sleep, but his body roiled with power from the sword, and her thread of vital shredded before it reached his shoulder. She shoved more through her other rings, attempting to weaken him, stun him, pour apathy into his mind. Nothing made it farther than his arm. He snarled at her, his face curling next to hers. With slow, purposeful movements, he brought the tip of the sword to hover just in front of her neck. I trusted you, fed you, honored you, even with your lies and secrets. And this is how you repay me? She focused on the vital humming in the thick bronze ring on her thumb. Put it down, she pleaded with him. Don't let it control you. It's evil. You know it is. His face took on a fanatical fury. You want it for yourself. Everyone wants to take what is mine. She shook her head, her eyes locked on the churning strands of shadow enveloping the blade. I want to destroy it. There was a rustle of motion in his doorway. 3 warriors stopped, their weapons ready. Naj ignored them, staring at Chasavia with a rabid possessiveness. You can't destroy it, he whispered. And for the arrogance of thinking you can, you will pay. He brought the tip closer. Have you already figured out that it doesn't have to cut the skin to feed? Chasavia thrust Vital out of her bronze ring. Violet light flashed, and a floodgate opened between them. The Vital inside Naj poured out of him and into her. Every bit of his life rushed out, like she'd thrown open a dam. But instead of weakening, his grip only grew tighter. She cast out and saw darkness from the sword rushing into his other arm, strengthening him faster than she could drain him. Cold fingers of fear gripped her as he leaned closer. He set the tip of the blade against her throat, and she squeezed her eyes shut against the coming ravenous death. But there was nothing but the feel of cold steel against her skin, and the nebulous draw for her to take it herself and wield it. She opened her eyes to see Naj glaring into her face, his breath coming fast, his expression filled with a cold, calculating rage. It's not ready to feed yet, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It still holds some life from its last kill. But that will be used up soon enough, and it will be hungry again. Since you are more than a common person, I think you will feed it more than once. So tomorrow, I'll chain you at the edge of the battlefield, and when swift death is hungry, you shall feed it and fuel my vengeance. Chapter 6. Chasavia's shoulders ached, and metal shackles dug into her wrists where they were bound behind her around a thick tent post. Dawn grew closer, and Naj strode through his room, dressing for the upcoming battle. Silence filled the space like a rancid fog. Every line of his body radiated violence and rage. 10 guards, already in full armor, surrounded her. Too many for her to fight her way through, even if there were any sunlight on the moors yet. Her mind scrambled after any way to stop Naj, but every idea failed in the face of the power stored in the black sword. And with the masterfully made connection runes on the blade, every time he used it, he would just grow stronger and more vicious. The corruption of the runes grated against her mind, something that could be used for healing, twisted to spread death to anyone it touched. Anyone but the bearer. Such a minor addition to the runes, and yet the exclusion of the bearer carried so much power. Chasavia raised her eyes to the clan chief. He was protected from the sword, but if she could break that protection... A spark of hope lit inside her. The runes on the sword itself were too intricate to change. She needed something on Naj, something he would never take off. She caught sight of his sun ring just as he pulled it off and dropped it in a golden dish near his bedside. What he didn't pull off was the leather bracer with its wide silver cuff. the emblem of his family. It was dented and scuffed, proving that he wore it even into battle, and the silver was soft. It would take a rune well. All it would need was a rune that connected him to the death he was dealing out to everyone else. Then, using the sword would also weaken him. If only she could touch the cuff. But there was no way he or any of his warriors would let her that close to him. Not until he decided to kill her in the battle. Unless... Her hope dimmed at the obvious answer. It would work. His greed to control powerful things would ensure that it worked. Still, she quailed at the idea. It was better than her current death sentence, but not by much. A life branded and enslaved stretched out in front of her, but she focused on the sword again. A little discomfort can be endured. Her heart pounded, but she ignored it. "Naj?" she said quietly, a quaver entering her voice despite her attempt to keep it firm. He stilled, his back to her. "I accept your proposal." He turned slowly, his face unreadable. "The moon ring is in my pocket. I accept." Crossing the room in 3 strides, he stood over her, gauging her. "You choose to be my wife, knowing I will never let you leave this clan?" A shiver of dread rolled over her, but she held his gaze. "Seems better than death." Fury warred with hunger in his eyes for a moment. "What makes you think my offer still stands?" "Because you are mired in a life of wounds and violence, and you know I can heal better than anyone else you'll find." His expression settled into a sharp, greedy pleasure. "Then it happens now." Chisavia swallowed down the repulsion inside of her and gave a short nod. "Get the brand," he commanded, and one of the warriors left. "And unchain my bride." Her shackles opened, and she bit back a groan of relief. The warrior returned, handing the red-hot brand of crossed swords to the chief. She scrambled to her feet. "No." Naj pointed to the furs at his feet. "Kneel." The command snapped out, heartless and cold. A hint of brightness lit the sky through the hole in the ceiling, and Chisavia reached out for the trickle of sunlight. It flowed into her like watered-down wine, thin and weak, but she funneled it to her hand. She knelt, pulling her left arm out of her robe and pushing up her short sleeve to expose her shoulder. "The ring," he said. She pulled the crescent moon ring out of her pocket and slipped it onto her first finger. A note of triumph filled his eyes, and he gripped her shoulder with his left hand, his metal cuff only inches from her face, as he held the brand in his right. "Chisavia of Queensland," he said. "Today you become my wife, bound to me until death." He raised the brand, and she gripped his other arm, wrapping her hand around his cuff as though to steady herself. Gritting her teeth, she nodded, holding the image of the rune she needed tightly in her mind. Just 6 simple strokes. He plunged the brand against her flesh, and pain exploded through her body. A scream tore out of her throat, even as she hurled Vital out of her hand and into the cuff, etching the first stroke into the inside of the cuff, then the second. The third and fourth were uneven, but sufficient. The fifth, crooked. The sixth, the longest and most nuanced, started strong. He pressed harder with the brand, and her focus shattered. The 6th stroke faltered at the end, twisting into a curl that negated everything it should have added to the rune. Naj pulled back, tearing out of her grip, and cold air raced over her arm as the brand seared in her skin. She gasped in breaths, and the red and gold walls of his chamber spun, twisting to the left as she fell to the furs. She shoved Vital into her own shoulder, and a wash of coolness rolled over the burn, but the pain barely receded. The 6th stroke was wrong, irreparably wrong. The connection would be weak, if it worked at all. Her mind scrambled to find a fix. A second rune would only interfere with the first, leaving neither working correctly. But changing the working rune... There wasn't enough time for such a drawn-out task. If she had an hour, maybe, but not in the few moments she had left. She cast out and caught the brightness of the new rune against his forearm. Vital slid along it, glowing faintly, and she let out a breath that was almost a sob. It would work. It was weak, but it would work. Using the sword was unlikely to kill him today, but it would weaken him. And for an outcome like this, she could be patient. Her confidence faltered. If the connection drained Naj slowly, how would she know it was doing anything? An idea flashed into her mind. She didn't have time to modify a complicated rune, but... Naj? She said, holding out her hand with the ring. He still held the brand in his right hand and gave her a hard look before offering his left. She gripped his cuff again, pressing her new crescent moon ring against the metal and shoving more Vital into them both as he pulled her to her feet. She carved the quick, simple strokes of matching connection runes on the interior of the cuff and the inner side of her ring. This one too weak to transfer more than a dribble of Vital. She stood and let go of his arm, fighting the dizziness that washed over her at the motion. The brand on her shoulder burned like fire, and she staggered against the tent post. She cast out one more time, and both the rune inside her ring and the newest rune on his cuff shimmered with light. Sinking against the post, she let out a breath of relief. "Chain my wife somewhere comfortable for the day," he said to his men, "and wrap her hands in layers of cloth and leather. Her magic comes through her palms." He set his finger under her chin again, raising her face. "Welcome to the Montan clan, my moon." He dropped his finger and started toward the door. "Don't use them today," Chisavia called after him. "They bring nothing but corruption and death, even to you." He didn't even slow. "I will keep and protect everything that is mine, with any tool I can find." Chapter 7. Chisavia lay on the side of Naj's bed, her left shoulder blazing with agony. A chain ran from the shackles on her wrists to the nearest tent post, and her hands were wrapped in so many layers of fabric and leather, they looked like massive paws. Naj and his warriors were long gone, but a perimeter of guards, the very young or the very old who hadn't gone to battle, still encircled his tent. She pulled at the shackles, but they didn't give. Sunlight now angled in through the chimney hole above his fire pit, and with it she could burn away the fabric on her hands and heat the metal until it melted, but only where they touched her skin, and the pain in her shoulder was crippling enough. "Patient," she repeated to herself again, breathing deeply. "I can be patient. He won't always be watching, and the rune will weaken him, eventually." She shoved away the thought of how long it could take. A glimpse of white caught her eye in the mid-morning sky through the chimney, and she leaned over, searching for the moon. But it was only a wisp of cloud. She sank back in exhaustion. A rustle near the doorway made her jerk awake. Rennis entered, moving quickly and glancing over her shoulder. She carried Chisavia's pack and a bundle of fabric. Hurrying to the bed, she dropped them both and pulled an iron key out of her pocket. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "I'll have you out in a moment." The first shackle clicked open. "What are you doing?" Chisavia breathed as the second opened, and Rennis began to unwind the wrappings on her hands. We're surrounded by guards. The side of Rennis's mouth curled up in a wry smile. By sleeping guards. She pulled an empty green vial of what had been Chisavia's sleeping potion out of her pocket. I dosed their breakfast. They'll be out all day. He'll kill you. Chisavia cast out, and every guard around the house was now slumped down onto the ground, as were a handful of bodies in nearby tents. Rennis dropped it on the floor, tucking it partially under the edge of his blanket, and shook her head. I dosed the rest of his wives too, and just took a drink myself. They'll blame it on your magic, and I'll be just as innocent as the rest of them. She finished unwrapping Chisavia's hands. Go now. To the left of the tallest hill, to the east, is a gully that forks enough times you can lose any pursuit that follows. It's past the goat herds. I have a servant's cloak and a basket of feed. No one should take notice of you, but you need to hurry. The battle will begin soon, and if the Pethin clan is unprepared, it will go quickly. Chisavia stood, wavering slightly on her feet. Come with me, Rennis. Rennis paused, but shook her head, rubbing at her face. I'll be asleep before you're past the flocks, and I can't leave. Everything I love is here. As his wife, all that is protected. If I were to leave... Chisavia wrapped her arms around the woman, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. Thank you. She stepped back, picking her words. Rennis, just be ready to leave. Naj will weaken, and when he does, his enemies will come for him, and all of you. The woman's brow creased. He does not weaken. He grows stronger with every battle. A burst of warmth rolled out of Chisavia's moon ring, and she twitched. The tiniest curl of shadow wrapped around the silver, and coldness seeped into her skin, canceling the warmth and growing until it felt like her ring was made of ice. Not anymore. Afternoon sun poured down on Chisavia as she gripped the edge of the huge boulder in front of her, peering over it as the Montan warriors destroyed the frantic encampment of their enemies. The air was thick with cries and shouts and the clang of swords. One figure swept into the midst of it like a scythe cutting through grass. Naj plunged the black sword into a man on the edge of the fight, and Chisavia's ring flared with heat. Plumes of shadows shot into the man as he convulsed and fell. Strands of shadows and icy blue light wrapped around Naj until he seemed larger than anyone else on the field. Chisavia's ring shifted to cold, dragging a trace of vital out of her and sending hairs of black shadows along her finger. Naj spun toward Chisavia, and she caught sight of his face, his teeth bared in a snarl. He swung the blue blade, and it sliced through a man as though he were nothing but mist. He slammed the pommel against another skull, sending the man flying back, his neck twisted and broken. 3 more men died in quick succession, before Naj raised the black sword again and drove it into another chest. Chisavia's ring ached with cold, and she peered at Naj. It was too far away to tell for certain, but there seemed to be a darkness that hovered around the cuff on his arm. She sank behind the boulder, letting it block the blood and death of the battle. She buried her face in her hands and focused on her ring. It pulled vital out of her, mirroring, in a much smaller amount, what Naj's cuff was doing to him. She dropped her head back against the rock, allowing herself a moment of frustration that it wasn't pulling out more. Taking a bracing breath, she looked at the truth of the situation. It will weaken him slowly, but he'll never stop using the swords. The more he does, the more it will drain him, until he is weak enough to conquer. Yet another goal that would require more patience than she wanted to give. She spent a moment mourning the victims he'd find first, then pushed herself off the boulder, her finger aching with cold. Staying low, she ran westward along the rocky gully that led toward home. Chapter 8. Chasavia sat next to the cairn, toying with her crescent ring, which had grown smooth over the years. The metal was warm from the heat of her skin. It hadn't been cold in weeks, as long as the bodies around her had lain festering on the moors. Wind blew from the west, setting tatters of red and gold fabric flapping from the corpses, snapping like bloody flags, but also blowing most of the stench away across the moors. Coming to this point had taken so much more patience than she'd imagined. Years of Naj's continued battles, years of death and suffering, years of the ring growing slowly colder each time, years of waiting for Naj to weaken enough to be stopped. The sun reached the peak of the sky, and she drew in the warmth of it. The day is shaped not by the violence of the storm, but by the fall of the light and the voice of the rain. The words rang both true and sorrowful. She rose, taking in the shallow pile of stones in front of her and wrapping the rune-covered cloth around her hand. The grave was unmarked, but a hum of power radiated from beneath it. Holding her unwrapped palm up toward the sunlight, she stretched her other hand toward the grave. A violet-tinted stream of light poured from her, growing brighter until the topmost stone shifted to the side. Another wave of regret rolled over her. If she'd known how to transfer Vital from a distance all those years ago, she might have formed the runes on Naj's cuff correctly. They might have actually worked quickly. More rocks moved until they revealed Naj's body. His skin was pale with death, but there was more changed about him than that. His cheeks were gaunt and sunken. The lines of his face were severe, his eyes fixed open in an expression of near madness. His braids were disheveled and shockingly gray. His swords lay crossed on his chest, and he gripped the hilts even in death. The top blade was wrapped in fingers of darkness, the other still coiled with threads of blue light. Naj's fingers were stripped clean of his rings, and the gold chain he'd worn at his neck was gone. Even the gold buttons had been ripped off his vest. His left forearm was bare, the skin lighter where his leather bracer with the metal cuff used to sit. Whoever had finally killed him must have believed the lie that the cuff was the source of his power. In a land where an honorable death was commemorated by burying the man with his most valuable weapons, these common, rough swords, whose power most would never see, must have been left by his enemies as an insult. Chasavia reached down to pull the black blade away from him. When she brushed the hilt, her fingers clenched around it, and a swirl of shadow enveloped her wrist. She yanked back, and the sword came free from Naj, but her own hand would not release it. Cold raced up her arm and into her chest, wrapping around her lungs, calling to her, filling her mind with images of death and destruction and the icy fire of conquest. She turned her face toward the sun, dragging in as much of it as she could. The light filled her with a rushing, humming warmth that drove back her fear and flowed down her arm. With a shout, she thrust Vital at the hilt and threw herself back. She crashed to the ground, and the black sword tumbled away into the brush. Pushing herself up, she rubbed her palm. No, these swords weren't meant for common people. It had definitely recognized something in her. Something it desperately wanted. She pulled out the thickest blanket in her pack and carefully wrapped the sword in it before tying it to the back of her saddle. She picked up the blue sword with her hand, wrapped in a tunic, but aside from the flickers of light that skittered along the blade, it seemed content to wait. Wrapping it as well, she tied it near the saddle horn, keeping the two blades as far from each other as she could. All of the keepers had agreed. The two swords should be separated, permanently. The blue one was safe to study, at which point they could hopefully find a way to destroy it. But the black? The black she would bury deep and in an unmarked grave, lost in the vastness of the moors. The hills stretched out into the distance under a formless gray sky, and she searched for the least interesting part of the dull landscape. A hill, indistinguishable from the ones around it, looked promising. She glanced down again at the grave. There was little left of the man she'd first met. His clever expression had been carved away by cruelty. This face was not one wrinkled by smiles or joy. Every mark on his skin spoke of violence and brutality, which matched the stories that she'd heard of his growing ruthlessness. A pang of sorrow vibrated through her at the thought of him when they'd first met. You could have been more. His hands still stayed clenched, holding phantom hilts. Or maybe you couldn't. Not once you had those swords. She held her palm up toward the sunlight again, drawing in the warmth and the wholeness of it. Reaching out her hand with the cloth, she funneled the lavender light into the cairn again, and the rocks settled back into place. Chesavia adjusted the crescent moon ring on her finger. I had planned on burying this here with you. But the moon is scarred and broken, much like you and I, and yet she still gives light to the world. Maybe keeping a reminder of that is a good thing. She mounted her horse. It turns out it was the moon who kept the sun in view, Naj, for as long as you burned. Turning her back on the death and wasted lives of the battlefield, she headed toward the distant, unremarkable hill. I hope you enjoyed listening to The Shadowed Blade Part 2 by J.A. Andrews, narrated by Karyne Norton. If you want to read more by Janice, go to jaandrews.com to find more of her books. I highly recommend starting with The Keeper Chronicles, which is narrated by Tim Gerard Reynolds, and the other books in her trilogies are narrated by Kate Redding. Both of those narrators are extremely popular and have their own following, which I didn't even realize was a thing. So I know you're going to love them. Some of you may have noticed I've added something new in the show notes this year. As much as I love having this podcast and being able to connect authors and readers, I'm trying to be realistic about what I can accomplish as well as where I spend my time and money. I spend 3 to 5 hours a week on the podcast without any financial return. And while that's not what I'm looking for out of this endeavor, that is 3 to 5 hours I could be spending with my family or writing. There are also hosting and advertising fees that eat into my author budget. I absolutely want to keep making more episodes, so this next phase of podcasting isn't a question of whether or not I'll keep doing it. It's a question of how can I keep doing it. It's possible I'll do something like Patreon down the road. It has a lot of similarities to Kickstarters that appeal to me, but there's also a lot of additional work that goes into something like that, and I'm just not ready for it. In the meantime, I've come up with 2 things to experiment with this year. I'll talk more about the second next week, but the first is adding a donation link to the show notes. This is 100% optional and is simply a way for those of you who can afford it to say, yes, we want you to keep making more episodes. I would love for this to eventually cover hosting and advertising fees, as well as possibly editing fees, which would save me both time and money that I can then put back into my writing. From here on out, the link, which is findingfantasyreads.com/donate, will be available in the show notes of every episode, and I will occasionally remind you of it in case one month is better than another for a donation. Please don't ever feel pressured to donate, but if you're enjoying the podcast and want to support it financially, there's now a way for you to do so. Before I sign off, don't forget to enter the giveaway. If you want a chance to win audiobooks and an Audible subscription, head on over to findingfantasyreads.com/giveaway to enter. As always, I will have links for all those sites in the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.